The Pan-Coalition Diplomatic Concordat had stood on Station Asheville for 211 years. It was the oldest continuously operating body in the galaxy, and it had exactly one rule that had never been broken. No delegate knelt before another. Not in ceremony, not in surrender, not in symbolism. The Concordat had been built on the idea that no species would ever again be made to kneel to another, after the Threll Wars had ended with 3 planets forced into ritual submission before their conquerors. The founding charter had been signed by 11 species in the wreckage of that war, in a chamber that still had structural scarring in its outer walls from the bombardment that had ended 2 years earlier. The scarring had never been repaired. It was left visible, deliberately, as part of the room. Every delegate who sat in the Concordat chamber sat facing it. In 211 years, 143 species had sent delegations. None had ever knelt. It was the single fact every child in the coalition learned before they learned their homeworld's flag. It was printed on the first page of the Concordat's public charter, in a typeface that had not changed in 2 centuries. No delegate shall be made to kneel before another. Humanity had joined the Concordat 9 years ago, the 144th species admitted, and by a wide margin the least understood. It had sent, in that time, 4 delegates. 3 had been recalled for reasons the records described only as diplomatically inconvenient, a phrase that, on closer reading of the sealed files, meant they had refused 3 separate ceremonial concessions that every other new member species had granted without objection. The 4th delegate was still there. She had been there for 2 years, and in that time the Concordat's internal notes on humanity had changed twice, and both times toward the word unusual. Delegate Mara Aconquovas was 31 years old, from a farming settlement on New Lagos that had no embassy, no military installation, and no listed reason for producing a diplomat of her caliber. The coalition's vetting office had read her application file twice, because the first pass returned a negotiation history that seemed inconsistent with someone who had never formally studied coalition law, had no diplomatic academy credential, and had listed her prior occupation as grain cooperative arbitrator. The verification had come back confirmed. 9 border conflicts resolved without escalation. 2 trade wars ended in under a week. 1 hostage situation on a mining colony resolved with no shots fired, no ransom paid, and both sides claiming afterward that they had gotten what they wanted. The vetting office had flagged this as statistically improbable and requested a second interview. Mara had answered every question plainly and offered, at the end of it, to explain how grain cooperatives settled water rights disputes between families who would still need to work the same irrigation channel the next season. The interviewer had not taken her up on it. 2 years later he would regret that. Mara had not mentioned any of this in her arrival briefing. She had unpacked her single crate, hung a photograph of a wheat field on her cabin wall, and reported to her post the next morning on time with tea for the reception staff. A gesture the staff found strange, then endearing, then, over months, simply expected. The challenge came during the Autumn Concordance, the annual session where junior delegates were permitted to observe but rarely to speak. The chamber was full that day, full in the way it only became when something on the agenda mattered to the senior delegations, and empty of anything that mattered to the junior ones, who filled the back rows out of habit rather than expectation. Ambassador Serensk Val, of the Threll Remnant, senior delegate, 3 centuries of service, chair of the Protocol Committee, proposed the motion the way that certain ambassadors propose motions, which is to say with the timing and tone of someone who has already counted the votes. He did not raise his voice. He did not need to. 3 centuries of being listened to had trained the room to lean in before he finished a sentence. The motion was simple. A ceremonial gesture of acknowledgement would be added to the closing rites. All new member species, on their 10th anniversary of admission, would perform a bow of full prostration before the Concordat seal, as a mark of gratitude for their inclusion. Anil dressed as tradition. Vol called it a small thing. He called it twice, a formality that costs nothing and honors much. Several delegates smiled. The category of smile that happens in rooms where an old hierarchy is quietly being restored, and everyone present already knows which side they are standing on. A few of the older delegations exchanged glances that were not quite smiles, something closer to recognition, the look of people who had seen this motion, or a version of it, proposed before. "That's a generous proposal," Mara said, in the tone of someone who genuinely found it worth considering. The room had not expected her to speak at all, let alone first. Full prostration, or the seated variant used in the Threll ceremonial code. Vol's smile widened by a fraction, the small, satisfied fraction of a man who believes the question confirms he has already won. Full prostration. As tradition requires. Humanity's 10th anniversary is in 11 months, Mara said. I'll need that in writing before I can bring it to my government. It was, on its surface, a procedural request, nothing more. Chairwoman Ilith Dressa, at the head of the table, said nothing. She had been waiting for this motion since the agenda was filed 3 weeks earlier, and she had spent those 3 weeks not preparing an objection, but preparing an archive. The written motion arrived the next morning, and with it, the Concordat archive chairwoman Dressa had quietly pulled 2 weeks prior. Not simulation, not projection, but the full ceremonial record of every gesture of acknowledgement ever performed in coalition-adjacent history, going back to before the Concordat itself existed. It was not dramatic the way propaganda footage was dramatic. It was administrative. Timestamps, signatures, formal complaint filings, the dry procedural language of governments recording what they had done to other governments and calling it custom. The first case was the Threll subjugation of the Asa cluster, 300 years earlier, the ceremony that had given the gesture its name. Delegates of Asa, kneeling before a Threll seal, filmed for a ceremony described in the record as gesture of gratitude for coalition protection. 11 months after the ceremony, the Asa cluster's asteroid mining rights had been reassigned to a Threll consortium. The reassignment paperwork cited voluntary transfer, consistent with expressed goodwill. The second was the same rite performed on the Varan colonies 40 years later, filed under a different word, welcome, though the choreography was identical down to the angle of the bow. 9 months after that ceremony, Varan's orbital shipping lanes had been placed under joint administration, with the administrating seat permanently held by the party that had proposed the welcome. The third case was smaller, a single trade outpost, a single delegate, no cameras, but a signed record all the same, and a resource concession that followed it by 6 months almost to the day. The fourth and fifth followed the pattern into the modern era, each one framed as tradition, each one preceding a treaty that transferred resource rights, shipping lanes, or administrative seats to whoever sat at the head of the table during the ceremony. 5 cases, 5 kneels, 5 transfers, not one exception in 300 years. By the fourth case, Vol was not smiling. He was watching with the expression of someone doing a calculation that was going to take longer than the session to finish, the expression of a man rereading his own family's signature on a document he had never personally opened. The room was silent in a way the Concordat chamber had not been silent in 211 years. Not the silence of shock. The silence of a room recognizing, all at once, and without anyone saying it aloud, that it had almost voted to continue a pattern it had spent 2 centuries pretending was over. Mara had not spoken during any of it. She sat with her hands folded, watching the projection the way she'd watch weather come in over a field, not with fear, just with the attention of someone who intended to still be standing when it passed. She did not look at Vol. She did not look for reactions. She watched the record the same way everyone else in the room was finally being made to watch it. Then the final document loaded. The Concordat's own founding charter, Article 1, the rule written in the wreckage of the Threll Wars, in the same chamber, facing the same unrepaired scarring on the wall. No delegate shall be made to kneel before another. Val's own government seal was on the signature page. His ancestor's name was on it, one of the 11 who had signed it, in the chamber that still bore the scars of what had made the signing necessary. Val stood. He did not raise his voice. He gathered his data slate slowly, the way a man gathers something when he needs the motion of his hands to occupy the space where words would otherwise have to go. He stopped at the door. The Asa cluster and the Varan colonies, he said, were not the same as this. He did not finish the sentence. There was no version of the sentence that finished well, and everyone in the room, including Val, understood that before he'd started it. He walked out. The chamber did not erupt into discussion. It sat, for a long moment, in the particular quiet of a room that has just watched 300 years of its own history get read back to it by someone from outside it entirely. Mara stood as well, and picked up the small cloth bag she carried to every session, the one with a handful of new Lagos wheat seed in it, the thing she touched before every hard negotiation and never explained to anyone who asked. She had carried it since her first day on Station Asheville. It had been in her pocket during the hostage negotiation that ended without a shot fired, and it was in her hand now. Chairwoman Dressa caught her at the chamber doors. "You knew," Dressa said. "It was not quite a question." "I asked for it in writing," Mara said. "Written things can be checked, that's all I did." "That's not all you did." Mara considered this the way she considered most things, without hurry. "No," she said, "but it's the part that mattered." Dressa watched her go, then returned to the head of the empty table and opened the Concordat's permanent session log. Beside Mara Akonquovas's name, in the space reserved for the day's outcome, she wrote 3 words. Motion withdrawn, precedent kept. She closed the log, looked once at the scarring on the far wall, the same scars that had been there since the charter was signed, left standing for 211 years, so that no one in that room would ever forget what the rule had cost the first time, and left the chamber dark for the night.